Welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name is David Wheatley. We're here to talk leadership in small, bite-sized and practical chunks. Enjoy. Well, welcome to this episode. I'm joined again by the good doctors, Judy Brown and Rick Eigenbrod, to have a conversation that builds on episode 129. We talked about letting go and the transition for leaders to let go of one role and move to the next, and how to make sure they were able to let go and set the next person up for success. Today, we want to talk about how leaders should prepare to end well. So how do we make sure that that's part of our skill set as a leader, that whatever it is we're doing, that we are prepared and we set things up to end whatever it is in a good way. Is that what we're going to talk about, Judy?
I think that's what we're thinking we're going to talk about. What kicked this off for me was some ongoing conversations I had with nonprofit leaders, and I would say in the field of support of elders. And when we're working with elders, we often use the phrase of the importance of ending well. But what I noticed with the CEOs, when I listened to what they were struggling with as new CEOs, they were relatively new, first year, second year, as heading these nonprofit organizations. Sometimes the biggest problem they seemed to have were what I would call the trailing effects of the way their predecessor left the position. And it took a lot of forms. Sometimes the person didn't spend useful time with them in prepping them for the terrain that they were entering, didn't necessarily provide the level of support to the board about who this new person was coming in and why they were a great person to follow. Often this was, and it's something we've touched on before, it was founder CEOs who created a situation that left their successor floundering because of the behavior of the founder. So it took a lot of different forms. And it left me thinking about this question of, what is the responsibility of me as a leader when, from the day I come in, to thinking about how to step out of this role and hand it off to somebody else in a way that is healthy for me, healthy for them, and healthy for the organization. There was a second thing that prompted this. I had a conversation with a friend of mine from a client organization in Texas, where the client of mine had decided it was really time for him to leave the position he was in, that he was just sort of worn out doing that thing. He really wanted to turn to something new. And the CEO, and I thought this was brilliant, said to him, "John, you can decide exactly how you want this to end." And I thought, what a generous and wise CEO to have that conversation with a valued employee about what was coming to an end, and all of them could sense it. So that, and I'm cycling off a board at the end of this year, and so I'm thinking about it for myself. What is ending well, stepping off this school board? And I wish I'd thought about it earlier, is what I'm thinking now. Why wasn't I thinking about this to start with? So that's what got us into those three things got us sort of into the middle of this muddle. And Rick, what do you want to add to this? And David, what comes to
Just
mind?
before Rick jumps in with his, because what you're identifying is people don't think about it until it's probably too late. And if you think about it too early, everybody else wants to know why you're thinking about it, which is the kind of tension in there.
Yes, yeah. Are you a lame duck already? What is this? You're
Yeah,
coming
are you
about
moving
this.
on? Have you got another job? Why are you thinking
Right,
about this leaving well thing at
right.
this stage when you're not actually thinking of leaving?
Right.
Rick?
And
Wouldn't that be interesting? And David, you just raised something. By the way, I'm going off of a board too, Judy. So personally, I'm going having this experience as well, and so I'm going to learn a lot here today that would be helpful to me, I hope. David, I think that I heard something quite different in a different way. If somebody says, "Are you preparing to lead?" The answer is yes. I am preparing to lead. Not now.
It might not be for 10 years.
yeah,
But absolutely, I am planning on how I would leave and what ending well would be as a part of my responsibility as a leader of this organization. And to model that, not just for the people under me, but for the institution. And we can come back to this because one of the things I found myself thinking about, Judy, was the role of the institution in ending well or preventing things from ending well.
mm-hmm.
So I know, I guess that what struck me here is this notion of it's a part of the leader's toolkit.
Right.
Is to know how to end well. And it doesn't mean ending well just on succession. It can mean ending well in terms of a project, a business unit, any number of things that in our lives have to do with ending. And I remember in my years working for a career consulting firm, one of the things that I heard someone say is they hardly ever remember how you came, but they never forget how you left. And how you leave is as important as any other contribution you made. And one of the things that I heard a group do is to say, gee, I'm still here and I'm still working, but if I was to leave and people who had been with me for these many years were sitting around having a beer, what story would they tell about me?
So that's a great question for everybody to be asking, is what story would people tell about me if I was to leave. One of the things that I picked up from Judy is that this idea of preparing to leave requires us to think about what are the component pieces that I need to be considering in that moment. Because like you say, it's not just about succession and handing the keys over to the next person. It's about laying the groundwork so that that person can be successful.
Exactly.
Well, it strikes me that it means carrying whatever role I'm carrying in such a way that while I appreciate that people value what I bring to this, that I'm not somehow so unique that nobody else would be able to step into this role. So it's creating a condition where people understand the unique skills that they might bring to this role were I no longer in it. And one of the things that got me going about this was it's always a book recommendation that gets us in trouble. The book called The Hero's Farewell by Jeff Seinfeld, I think.
Sonnenfeld.
And what struck me is the title of The Hero's Farewell, which is that if we've become I'm going to say this is my version of it now, too heroic in this position, too essential, to the job and me are the same thing, that's a danger for me because I'm not going to be very willing to step out of it and let somebody else have it because I'm all wrapped up in it. But it's also a danger for the organization because it is not thinking and behaving in a way of understanding the different talents that might play in this job, including the job of being CEO. And the different way in which a new person in that position might give a jolt of vitality to it that after a while I probably can't. And that if I want to stay vibrant after a while, I may need to be not only ready to welcome someone else in this position, but I need to be thinking about where might I put my life energies next that is a good investment of those. And it's that kind of thinking that we need to be about all the time to keep from wrapping ourselves and our ego and our purpose so much in a single position that we can't extricate ourselves from it with grace. And so anyway, it's that kind of stuff that should be on our mind.
Yeah,
Rick.
Judy, you really triggered. There's a couple of things you triggered for me. I mean, and as we were sort of talking and remembering about Sonnenfeld's really absolutely fabulous work, and he talks about the sort of typologies of lead taking, the monarch, the general, etc. And the point of the book was there are these sort of typologies, if you will, and how the leave-taking style has huge impact on the institution. The real important part, I think, was it's not just what are the leave-taking styles, but what are the impact of each of those styles on the organization. And I think that's a really important thing. Two things struck me. One is this notion of the irreplaceable leader. And what's the thing? The cemetery is filled with irreplaceable people. And not just that I act like I'm irreplaceable. I think it's also possible for the institution to believe that someone is irreplaceable. And so I think there's an institutional dynamic here. I put my own typology together, and if you'll bear with me, I came up with 3: hanging in, hanging on, and hanging out. Hanging in is what happens when an individual should be going, but they in the institution sort of believe, no, you can't leave us now.
Right.
We need you now. And so I'm hanging in. Hanging on means I can't let go, or they can't let go of me. And what is it that we're hanging on to? Often hanging on for me is a function of, often for the leader who hangs on, it's like, here's the line that comes from some of my other work. If you, the worst reason to stay is you don't know where else to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think leaders will hang on because they don't know where else to go. And maybe it's true for the institution. They hang on to a leader because they don't know where else to go, meaning there's nobody like Mary, there's nobody like this, we don't know where to go to, et cetera, et cetera. And the last one is hanging out. And this is a version I've seen, and I don't know, Judy, you can talk about this, whether you've seen it in the organization you work with, but certainly in family businesses, you get this dynamic of hanging out. Yes, we're going to bring the next generation on, and Sue will become the new CEO, and we're going to keep an office for Dad. And Dad will pop in every now and then. And of course, when Dad comes around, everybody goes to check with Dad to see, Sue told us to do this. Do you agree? And by their very presence of hanging out, they have created the inability for the organization to move forward and for Mary to move in.
Right.
So all 3 of those, Rick, are, you're saying, whether you're hanging in, hanging on, or hanging out, you're a problem.
You're a problem.
So I came up with a 4th.
What you got?
Hanging up. Hanging up your hat, putting it on the coat hook, and with your coat and saying goodbye. You guys are going to be just fine,
Right.
just terrific. Let me know in a year how you're doing.
Yeah. I'll see you at the Christmas party or something.
Yeah.
And no, you can't call me. I think the other thing that struck me, and you guys won't be surprised that I've connected this to development, that the hanging on, the inability to leave well, will certainly truncate the development of the people underneath me, my successors and others. It will truncate their development because it kind of keeps us in this dependency relationship with the leader. Knows all, sees all. She will tell us what to do and we will go do it and it'll all be great. It reduces our anxiety because so-and-so's in there to look after us. So I think the notion, whether you're hanging in, hanging on, hanging out, and not hanging your hat, in a sense, you are truncating the development of the leaders. So somebody could say, well, I don't know if the next person is really ready. Or I don't know whether the team's ready to take on the next, No, it doesn't matter that they're ready. That's not the point. What they're ready to do is take on not being ready. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's the whole thing that comes out of the Center for Creative Leadership, that development takes place in critical events, in the crucible. So if somebody said, well, the team's not ready to take on this responsibility, the answer is great.
Right. They're just where they need to be.
It's just where they need to be. And Mary's not seasoned enough. Perfect.
Right.
So there's a fifth one, which I wouldn't group into the same group and I wouldn't put a hanging prefix on it. But there's a fifth one, which is I'm providing the right leadership for the organization right now, which is if I'm doing that, then I'm in the right place. And if I'm not doing that, then one of the others applies. And I should be hanging up, or I'm probably hanging out or hanging in or hanging on.
Hanging around. Exactly.
But that idea of providing the right leadership for the organization right now is what we should all be looking at in all of our roles.
Right.
And if I, for some reason, needed to leave tomorrow to step out of this position and I would not be there, the organization would have the capacity to carry on without me. And one of the things that struck me in this, I was thinking about when the leader becomes totally wrapped up in their own, who they are, and this job is the whole thing. It eliminates the potential for good collaborative work. It's not only that it hurts the next person who tries to take over in this situation, but it's a culture that's focused on solo, unique, irreplaceable talent.
The hero.
That's exactly right.
Bell is talking about. We create these heroes and come to believe we cannot survive without them.
Right. And then they buy into that too. And they forget to develop themselves as human beings. And so then they're locked into staying because there's nothing on the other side of going.
And think about boards. What does a board contribute to these hanging in, hanging on, or ending well? Is there succession planning? Or are there conversations about how we as an organization are going to handle the dynamics of moving on and moving in? So I see it, I think for me, we started talking about it at an individual level. And all of a sudden my mind went to, oh, it's not just about the individual, it's about the organization. And then what part of the organization? Well, might that include the board?
Right. And you'd almost figure from the amount of energy we're putting into this that it matters a lot. I'm realizing just in terms of voice tone, it's like we're worked up about this. This matters.
Well, and if I drive it back to, you both said you're in the process of leaving boards.
Yes.
And so what are you doing to make sure you leave well? What are the tactical specifics of that to make sure
Wow.
you, when you hang up your hat, that you do it in the right way, which then brings you to my thought of what's the leadership you're providing right now to make sure that you can end well?
Wow.
That's a great
It's a
question.
great question. I'd
and
say in my case, I'm having a lot of one-on-one conversations with other board members in which I underscore the particular power and talent I think they bring to the situation, um, to us as a board, what I've noticed that they've done that has made a difference, what I've learned from them. So that's a great question, David. It's one, for me personally, it's the quality of conversation with people on the board. Rick, you,
Oh, it makes me be thoughtful too, David. Thank you. Is this podcast for you and me, Judy? I don't know.
This episode is, yeah.
yeah,
This-
thank you.
A couple of things come to mind. I think one is modeling. The board I'm on has very little turnover, and we've done it on on a kind of crisis basis. Some member of the board had to leave for whatever reason. We hurry up and replace them. So I'm trying to do it in such a way that I am the model for that transition. How do we think about it, not just for me, but that the way we think about it for me can now serve as a template for those who are going to come after me.
Mhm.
I'm trying to leave ending well in tone. The attitude and tone and affect I have about the leaving, for me is a real contribution, because I hear about other boards where it can get rancorous and get, people can get resentful, et cetera, that I'm trying to model a sense of it's time.
Mhm.
It's time. And when it is time, we recognize it's time. We treat it as natural, normal, and that it's not a traumatic event. And my attitude about it is collaborative, cooperative, and maintains cohesion as we go through this. I too, Judy, have had conversations with each and every one of my fellow board members, and those have been enormously helpful, because it is sensitive when it's just time. Everybody knows it's time. They don't want to say to you, well, it's time. And if you don't have a template for that, it makes it more difficult.
Mhm.
Whereas if you have age outs, or you have term limits, you have succession plans, it depersonalizes it. So
But
I'm
so
trying to make
that makes it
easy.
easy though as well, doesn't it? So I have an age out or a success or a term limit, that makes it easy. What we're talking about here is when it isn't easy, and
Yeah.
it should still be something that a leader is doing.
Well, and absolutely. And so I am in the absence of what this has triggered, which is some serious discussions about succession. How are we going to think about succession? How does that turn into a plan? What goes into it, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to feel like one of my contributions in leaving is to help the board come to terms with and develop a great process for leave taking.
Mhm.
So it doesn't have to feel personal, and it doesn't have to feel oversensitive, and it doesn't have to feel like this is a one-off or something like that. So I'm trying to make my leaving in tone, in tenor, in process, a contribution that I'll leave behind.
Rick, I've got a post-it up here, my many post-its, that says modeling or permission giving. And I think that often modeling, in the case that you're talking about, is permission giving to other board members to initiate the conversations
Yeah.
and the collaboration early on in the process. So that the tone and tenor you're talking about is possible and natural. And I'm thinking in my own case, because there are term limits, I still think that there is much work that is productive and needs to be done by the person who is coming to the end of the term limits.
Agreed.
Something that creates the word that comes to mind is a kind of springboard into the future for the people who remain on the board. So there's more to it, both personally and organizationally, than the final fancy dinner that is just an automatic at the end of 2 4-year terms, 8-year cycle. There's some more personal responsibility, I think, on the part of the board member. And I think this brings us back away from boards to organizational roles to show initiative and sensitivity and awareness of its time dynamic that you're talking about, Rick, that is healthier for the individual and the organization, even when there is a formal process in place.
Which
think-
really, Judy, gets to the, am I as a leader routinely asking if I'm still the right person to be in this position?
Yes.
And the willingness to be both vulnerable and self-aware in that space,
Right.
to say, am I the right person? Because if I'm not, then the odds are I'm hanging up, on, out. It's one of the
Yeah.
one of those things.
Yeah,
But
right.
I think you're also, it makes me think about there's kind of two paths, if we can go. One of them is I have a long glide path and I can see that, and I'm going to retire in 2 years or whatever that, and I use the term glide path because I'm kind of decelerating to that spot.
Right.
And if I'm decelerating, that means I'm not going at the same speed and then just suddenly stopping.
Right.
But if I'm decelerating, then somebody else has to be accelerating in order to maintain the same speed that the organization moves on. So
Yes.
that I need to be thinking about that. What am I letting go of at what stage? So that then somebody else can pick it up. So that on the last day of my job, I have nothing to do because everything's going and it's going the right way. But then there's also the short version of that, which is I've just got a new job. I'm giving you my 2 weeks notice. How do I make sure I've let go in the right way?
Yes.
Within 2 weeks. One of the things that the word jumped into my mind as you were speaking, David, as we were speaking, this notion of space. One of the things I want to leave ending well is I leave space. And so, and I mean, I'm making this up on the fly, but there are things that are really symbolic that have to do with space. Office, for example, comes to mind. Do you take over the office of the old leader? Have you ever thought about, no, don't do that. Turn that into the coffee room or whatever, the meeting room, and I'm gonna make my own space. That's so important.
Wow.
This notion of making space, that was your territory. This is Robert Ardrey stuff, on territoriality. It's really, really important. That was your territory for so long. It's really hard for me to come in and inhabit that physical territory. Might we think about not doing that? And just so those sort of thoughts, which I don't think we give a lot to. What are the symbols that? How do you create space? And the old symbols go, for example, in terms of symbols, those go away to make space for new symbols. I mean, I have seen people that overtook the CEO, that came into the CEO office, and there's nothing. They haven't put pictures up. They haven't moved in.
So then, if I go back to what Judy's saying about the onus of our conversation, in particular being on the person who's leaving,
Mm-hmm.
that Are you
agree.
saying there, Rick, that maybe the person who's leaving a month before they're due to leave moves out of that space and starts using a smaller, less significant space so that
Wow.
it cleanses that
Yeah.
space for the next person?
Yes, David. So I love that imagery. I love that imagery. You know, it's one of my contributions is to create psychological space. Somebody comes to your office and you know you're leaving in 2 or 3 months with a question. You go, you know, Mary or Peter, Paul, whatever. That's really a question now for Jim. That's really a question you know. I create space. I can really help with that transition. It's simple as the old gang got a friend of mine. I was complaining when that's something that we sold ourselves, and I was complaining about all the stuff. And he goes, "Rick, you gotta understand, the old gang doesn't meet here anymore."
Yeah.
And this notion about as a leader, I can give that message in a million different ways. The old gang doesn't meet here anymore.
Right. And the understated part of that is, and it's going to be just fine
Yes.
for you, and it's going to be just fine for me. That this is a natural transition, and it's time. I mean, that's what the other example that keeps coming to mind for me, David, is the one that you've talked about, which is a different way of dealing with this, which is you and John on alternate years being the CEO.
Yeah, we alternate the president. I get the odd years. I don't know
Right.
why.
But what I love about that is that's a very creative way to help the organization stay supple in the face of leader transition. I mean, think what that's modeling for people, because it's so out of our usual way of thinking about it. It's the symbolic again, with really practical dimensions to it.
I think as something that the Humanergy Leadership Podcast is going to be doing in 2024 is about once a month, we're going to be talking to a family business about what it's like, what the important things of a family business are. I've already started having some of those conversations. And one of the themes is that the person took over because dad got ill, which goes to the crucible, Rick, of, you know, dad hadn't planned this. Dad hadn't decided. I was just thrown in, and all of a sudden we had to work out how to do this. And we did, and we learned that. One of the other things I've learned from one of my clients that did exactly what we would all cringe about. Second generation dad said, I'm handing over to third generation daughter, and I'm going to stay on as the CFO. And you see, Rick, I had the same response that you just had, that I kind of went, oh, I don't know if that's a good idea.
Right.
And yet they've done it excellently. And one of the keys to them doing it excellently was the complete and utter lack of dad's ego. And whenever dad was in the room, he would make sure he wasn't in the key seat, that he moved where he sat, that when asked a question and everybody looked at him, he would move his chair physically to point to his daughter and wait for her to answer. And a whole series of things that he's done really well to make this transition so smooth. But it really, at the bottom line of it is, he removed his ego from the situation and said, I'm here to help for as long as you need me, but I'm not the CEO. This is your company now. Now, the fact that he's still an owner means that he has, but it's, you know, that physical shift that he made, and the mental shift that he had to make from the perspective of ego, I think made the massive difference, which is interesting. As we talk about all of these things, I imagine a lot of it's about letting go of that ego that hangs on to or hangs out because of that title and position and that authority. And like Judy, you were saying about founder CEOs, the worst thing in the world is when I hear the new CEO say, oh yeah, the founder CEO is now on my board.
Which is really common. By the way, it's a brilliant story. And I think if you take that story and really peel the onion on that, you get some important things, some of which reference what we've talked about, the importance of symbols. the importance of space. That's not my space at the head of the table. That's her space at the head of the table. The making space conversationally, redirecting in a subtle way. I mean, kudos to him and to her and to them to be able to pull that off. I mean, that's a wonderful, inspirational kind of set of possibilities for people that they could think about. But look what it's going to take to do that, and how many people can do it. There's a piece of this that I just want to get out. People will read you. People will read the leaving person. They will want to feel, are you okay? Are you going to be okay with leaving? Are you okay with leaving? And do we feel like you feel you're going to be just fine after you leave? It's a very subtle kind of thing.
Which is, I think, is another piece that goes back to what can you do? You can, because you talked about communication, both of you coordinating, that, you know, are you telling people what your thinking is on things, what
Yes.
input you've had on things, what you've brought to different things, and what value you see them bringing, so that you're making that smooth? And are you also, in some ways, Rick, sharing what's next, so that they see that you're comfortably going to something else?
They don't even worry about you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you can't say, I'll miss each and every one of you. I'll miss each and every day. Right? But I'm really looking forward to, it's just, this is a great time for me to go do that. Like, both of those are true.
And the last piece that I wanted to go back to was that idea of the 2 weeks notice piece. Because I know one theme that we said early on was, from day one, leaders should be preparing to leave well. And I had a situation recently where the CEO called and said, my CFO just gave me a week's notice, and basically doesn't want to work that week because they're already into the next job. And so what that sounded like is they just got dumped on by their CFO. And so that's not what we're talking about. What would it look like if I was the CFO moving to a new job, and we've got one CFO amongst us, former CFO. If I was the CFO, I've got a new job, I'm giving you the 2 weeks notice. What would I have done to make the CEO say, great, congratulations, I love the way you've left it?
Exactly.
I would have developed a really good staff around me. I would have, as part of the executive team, been really forthright in sharing the way I thought about important financial issues in the organization. Where I would have disagreed with somebody on the leadership team about a particular direction financially, I would have been willing to share my thinking and still have been good-spirited about understanding another's point of view, so that there was a sense in the leadership team overall that the financial well-being of the organization was held collaboratively.
Right. And I think that's important, that you'd have been transparent about what you were doing with your team as well.
Yes.
So they'd all have visibility to all the pieces that you did. So
Right.
it wasn't suddenly this big clunk.
Which brings me back to this thing of giving up on the hero and the solo hero from the very beginning, but somehow offering a worldview within the organization that we all need to have a sense of how our piece plays into the whole. And we all need to be willing to have forthright conversations about that, so it's a shared understanding.
Right.
That's a really interesting question to have asked, David. I mean, because there are going to be situations in which the person is going to say 2 weeks and I'm out. And part of the smoothness of that, of the grace, has to do with how the 2 weeks are handled. But the large part of it has to do with how they have lived the years up to that point.
Yep. Yeah. Or your dad has a stroke one day, all of a
Yep.
sudden you're in
Yeah.
charge.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
I think it's interesting what you were talking about. That is there transparency there? Is the
Mhm.
understanding there? Is the development there?
The development.
Because that crucible, with those things in place, makes it feel like I've gone in with armor and a spear. Without those things in place, I'm naked in the crucible, and that makes me significantly more vulnerable.
There's another
David, I'm sorry, Judy.
there's another piece to this on the family business side. I'm thinking of a family I was really close to, where the father dropped dead while the son was in law school, I think, and who the son had dreamed of being a first-rate lawyer and then of becoming an academic. And Victor never got to do that. He continued on as the CEO. And there's something about having a firm that would hold the notion of, yes, he needs to take over because his father died, but he's not chained to this as a legacy for the rest of his life.
Right.
And where that doesn't happen, people's dreams end up not being realized, and their development ends up not being realized. So there's another ethic in this that I think is really important, because sometimes the CEO does keel over and somebody has to step in.
Before I stepped on your line, Judy, I'm sorry.
And last thought, Rick.
One last thought, and maybe this is a good closer. Your story about the person who gave 2 weeks notice, not really, right? And all the impact that has takes me back to something we talked about early on. They may remember how you came. They will always remember how you left and the stories they will tell about you. And people are going to be out in the world telling stories about how this person left.
Yeah, I just did.
And you are living proof. Because we think, oh no, not, and
Yep.
that's exactly what it brought. Look at the story you told, David. And that story will be out there about that person forever.
And I guess I'd pick up on that and close on two thoughts that stand out for me today. That from day one as leaders, we should be preparing to leave. And on a regular basis, we should be asking the question, am I providing the right leadership for this organization right now?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, the cautions of, am I hanging in? Am I hanging on? Am I hanging out? Or do I need to hang up?
Lovely.
Well done.
Rick, Judy, thanks very much for joining us. I appreciate the conversation. We have a conference coming up. Do you know what the conference is, Judy, that we're going to in DC?
Yes, it's the Leadership Summit of Leading Age, which is the umbrella organization for nonprofits who serve elders. And we are going to be having a chat about under-examined elements of leadership.
And I just want to make sure so that those folks who are in that industry, in that world, if you are going to be in DC in April, we're going to be attempting to do a live version of this conversation in front of the group. We hope to see some of you there. And I just wanted to get that sales pitch in before we closed. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Judy. And we'll hear you next time.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
That was the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name's David Wheatley. For further information about Humanergy, go to humanergy.com or check out our latest book, What Great Teams Do Great, from all good bookstores. Have a good one. Stay healthy.